Seated. Oh, I tell you, I love that gospel. I'd love to preach on it, but I'm going to stick to my pattern, and I'm going to be sharing about the the first reading, and that's actually one of my favorite readings because it teaches us a great deal about faith. When Israel, yesterday Moses had was taken up to heaven or died and God buried him, whatever. Well, they're on Mount Nebo, and then Joshua takes over. And there's a principle there, and Joshua is commissioned by Moses through the laying on of hands to take over his role. In fact, Jesus himself does that, right? He commissions the apostles. He lays hands on them. He breathes on them so that they receive the Holy Spirit. And indeed, the apostles had successors, which were the bishops, and up to this day, this has always been the way that authority in God's kingdom has been passed down through the laying on of hands. So Moses laid hands on Joshua. Joshua took charge. And then God tells Joshua that they're going to go into the promised land. Now there's a problem here because there's the Jordan River, which was at flood stage. Most of the time the Jordan River is kind of shallow and small, and you can probably walk across it without too much trouble. But when it's at flood stage, you can't. The water's moving fast, it's deep, you can't get across it, you'll be swept away. But God tells Joshua to have the Levites take the Ark of the Covenant and to carry it into the river. And that's exactly what they do. I often wonder about the Levites who are in front of this procession. They're walking into the river. They've got the Ark of the Covenant, which of course is lined with gold. It's a heavy box. That's why it takes several Levites to carry it, right? On poles. You've seen the Ark. You've seen Raiders of the Lost Ark. You know how this works. And so they're walking into the water, and it gets to their feet, and then it gets to their ankles and their shins and their knees. They're walking into the water carrying this heavy box because God had promised to make a path for them. They had to step into the water first. And then after they were in the water, after they all were in the water, God stops the flow of the Jordan River. It stops flowing. And then the Israelites cross along on dry land. Now, one of the things we know about this period of history is it's a period of a great deal of geophysical activity. The volcano in the Greek island begins with an S, I can't think of it. Anyway, had just erupted not long before that. There were many earthquakes, and this was probably one of those earthquakes that's taking place at this time. They're walking into the river, an earthquake temporarily diverts the path of the Jordan, and they walk across on dry land. And after all the Israelites had made it through, the earth readjusts, and here comes the water again. Everybody knows there's another earthquake 7 days later. What happens in the next earthquake? The walls of the city of Jericho collapse, and Israel takes the city of Jericho. This is a time of great geophysical upheaval, but God is giving them instructions. Now, if they were not obedient, would the earthquake had still happened? Probably. But they had just been standing there watching it and not knowing what to do about it. But they listened to God. And they believed that God was going to do something, so they gathered all the people, made them ready to travel. They packed up their tents, and they started into the river. And it wasn't until they got their feet wet that God worked his miracle, and the river stopped. So many times in our lives, God calls us to do something. But we have to respond. And when we respond in faith, when we answer God's call and do what he asks us to do, we see the miracles begin to happen. This is a marvelous thing that God does for us. But see, it's not all about what God does. It's also about our response to God. So as we hear God and we listen for his voice and we respond in faith, then we know that God is going to work his miracle. And that's a wonderful thing. This is fascinating, and I'm just going to touch on the psalm that Lisa read to us, because three events are mentioned in the psalm today. The first incident is the sea beheld and fled. We're talking about the crossing of the Red Sea. As Israelites come to the Red Sea, the sea backs off so that they can cross. In the King James, they call it the Red Sea. We had that discussion about, right, the Bitter Lakes. But the sea backs off so that they can cross on dry land. The second reading was this, right? The second great event. Jordan turned back in today's Psalter. As we just talked about in today's reading, the Jordan River stops so that they can cross the Jordan. And then the third is this: the mountains skipped like rams. Now, we don't necessarily see where that is in the scriptures, except that, as like I'm sharing in this point of history, there's a tremendous amount of geophysical upheaval, that there are earthquakes all across the region, which is a key to Israel's ability to move into the Promised Land and take possession of it, especially take possession of the high ground. As we read later, we see that Israel possesses the hills, and there's still Canaanites and Philistines all along the plains, and they have to, and actually it falls to David to clear out the rest of the Canaanites and the Philistines. But the mountains skip like rams as they take possession of the Promised Land, and all this geophysical activity. There are earthquakes and the mountains are shaking. Well, guess what happens when the mountains start shaking? All the people who live there flee, right? Get away from the mountain. And Israel, taking possession of the land, goes, nobody's living in the mountains anymore. Let's move in. And through these three miraculous events, God has brought Israel to take possession of the land. The parting of the sea, which allows them to cross the sea into the Sinai, the parting of the Jordan that brought them into the Promised Land, and then the mountains shaking and quaking that gives them the ability to take possession, gather their foothold, their beachhead there in the Promised Land. So, but here's the important thing. The important message today is, when God speaks, don't be afraid. Even if you have to get your feet wet, God will come through. He will fulfill his word. However, very important to realize this: don't put God to the test. Don't say, well, I'm going to put myself at risk and God will come through and do what I want. It doesn't work that way. You must hear the voice of God and know what God has called you to do. Step forth, and God will work his miracles for you. Let's go to God now in prayer.